on the topic of collaborations, you have a long track record of collaborating with Jonathan Potter, who also came here at Loughborough.
This sounds like a criminal investigation. I've studied police interrogations. You have a long track record of working with this bunch of known associates, Jonathan Potter. Anyway, guilty as charged. I won't.
Maybe I should have framed it as friendship, or
yes.
use a different word, to refer to your relationship. Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, I'll put it in context first, which is that Mick Billick had arrived at Loughborough the year before Jonathan did. We had a discussion group going, which turned into the book called Ideological Dilemmas. That was all before Jonathan came here. And that book, Ideological Dilemmas, was very much Mick's work, I think. Everybody else, the authors all worked on it. I wrote the chapter on education, and I used a kind of reanalysis of Plato's description of Socrates and the slave boy in the dialogue called the Meno. And I'd done that for the book Common Knowledge, but there wasn't really room for it, and it was a bit weird compared to the rest of that book. So I used it for a chapter in Mick's book. That's how that came to be there. It was kind of already made. At the same time, what we all did was basically adopt Mick's kind of framework of interest in ideology and rhetoric, and we used that as a theme for addressing all of our concerns. Okay, so DARG only became DARG, or named DARG, after Jonathan arrived, which was a year or so later. But still before he came, Mick was book review editor for a psychology journal. And he handed me this book called Discourse and Psychology and suggested I might want to review it. And I'd never met Jonathan or Margie Weatherall then. It looked interesting, so I did. I read it and reviewed it. But when I was about halfway through this book, I suddenly realized that, hey, I can call what I do discourse analysis. There's this name, discourse analysis. Now, up until then, people had asked me, what do I do? And I didn't know what to say, Or they'd say, what method do you use? And I'd say, well, I collect recordings of people talking, and I kind of think of things to say about it. And, so I was like stuck for saying what my method was. And I was also quite enjoyed being stuck for that, because I didn't particularly want to use an off-the-shelf method. But anyway, reading this book, Discourse and Psychology, I realized I could use this name. From then on, I could say, I do discourse analysis. Even though I never did the kind of discourse analysis that's mostly in that book, the kind of interpretative repertoires and interview studies. I didn't do that kind of work. But I loved the idea that I had something to call it, and I could see it was work that was compatible with and alongside what I was doing, because it was also using the analysis of discourse to interrogate cognitive assumptions prevalent then in social psychology, especially attitudes and attitude measurement and attitude theory. So that was it. So Jonathan arrived, I say arrived, he was actually interviewed by Mick and me and a group of other people. So we sat there grilling Jonathan alongside other candidates for a while, and he eventually got the job. So that's how he came here. That's a short version of it. So yes, what happened then was we got on well as friends. We had lots of academic angles, interest in language, interaction, conversation analysis. He also brought something new for me, which was his background in social studies of science, especially the sociology of scientific knowledge. And he introduced me to Malcolm Ashmore, who eventually joined the department as well. So for me, it was a very exciting time, new collaboration, new ideas, new directions. And we spent a lot of time talking about things in DARG sessions, in our offices, over dinner, in the pub. We spent a lot of time. with other people sometimes, often just us, just going through things. And yeah, that was a very exciting moment for me in the development of my research career. Yeah.
Is that how discursive psychology was born?
Yes. The book Discursive Psychology was written after we'd done some collaborative work, after we'd published a few things. We'd published some empirical studies involving factual discourse, stake and interest and so on, which was again a kind of subject-object relations theme. And we'd also written an article for the prestigious journal Psychological Review, which is the exception to the general rule that mainstream psychology won't have anything to do with us. We actually got into this journal. And it seemed that these various things we were doing were coherent enough that we could turn them into a book. So we basically cannibalized some articles and things we'd written and wrote things around it and turned it into a book. Now, one feature of the book is that it has, towards the end of the book, this thing called the discursive action model. And that was something that was originally in the Psychological Review article. Now, I feel a bit accountable, and maybe Jonathan does, for having produced this thing called the discursive action model, and then pursued research after that without really referring to it much. You know, what one would normally do, having invented a model of something, is base a research program on it or start referring to it a lot. We didn't. And I'll tell you the reason. And that is that when the editors and reviewers for Psychological Review came back to us with comments on our article, which they found quite mystifying, really, and weird. It was called, like, you know, that maybe it would be the first post-modern article in Psychological Review. But one of the things was, the editor wanted us to produce, it said, very interesting stuff, all about language, how it works and so on. But can you produce a process model? A process model. An information processing model. In other words, a kind of flow diagram of whatever, of this thing, because that's what psychology does. You know, so we were a bit flabbergasted, given that if you'd read what we'd written, that was the last thing that would be appropriate to ask. You know, we were not doing that. You know. Anyway, we succumbed to the attraction of having anything in Psychological Review. I mean, we could have just said, okay, forget it, we'll withdraw our article and go somewhere else. But no, we were captured by the prestige of the journal. And so what we did was, it's almost a joke. We wrote this thing called the Discursive Action Model. That's why it's called a model, as if it's not a model, but, you know, whatever. And we made it look neat and orderly, and 9 points divided into 3 sections, and that was it. So we produced something. And of course they saw that it wasn't a model, but they were fed up arguing with us by then. And so the article got published. And so the book also contains it. Now, I've said it was done for that kind of rather jokey reason, but in fact, I don't want to withdraw it altogether. It is a succinct summary of some of the key features that anyone would have to take account of if they wanted to do the kind of work we were recommending. So it's serious enough. But it wasn't really our predilection to produce a model and then work out the empirical consequences of a model and test it in a hypothetico-deductive fashion. That simply isn't how we worked or wanted to work. So the book, Discursive Psychology, yes, it was fun. It originated that way. And it's also the origin of the term discursive psychology. And that's because I remember we were sitting in, well, my memory is probably bad, but I remember sitting in a pub talking about what should we call the book, you know, and we had like discourse analysis of whatever it was. And whoever came up with it, we came up with Discursive Psychology as a title for a book. Because it was, for a book title, we wanted it to be short and pithy and memorable and so on. It sounded like it was something, you know, just discursive psychology. So the origin of it was the title of a book. Yeah. And after that, we started referring to the work we did in general as discursive psychology.
So in 1997, you published Discourse and Cognition. Is that continuing the tradition of developing discursive psychology? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, very much. I saw it as an exercise in discursive psychology. In fact, I think I wrote that on the back or in the blurb, that it should be read as an exercise in discursive psychology. By the time I came to write that in 1996, it was published in 97. In fact, Jonathan and I both realised we'd done quite a lot and moved quite a way since 1991, 92, when Discursive Psychology was written. And by the time we came to this point, I say we because we were actually working separately at that time as well as together, and we were each writing a book, a different book. And I saw those two books as related, as being a pair of books. Jonathan was writing Representing Reality, and so he was pursuing and setting out his long-term interests in the construction of reality. And I was writing Discourse and Cognition, working out and setting out a long-term interest in the relation between cognition and language. And both books drew on somewhat, largely overlapping resources. Jonathan was always more into post-structuralism than I was, but we drew on linguistic philosophy, conversation analysis, ethnomethodology, philosophy of language, social studies of science. But in fact, historically, the origins of discourse and cognition were older. It goes back, in fact, to when I first came to Loughborough to teach the course Thought and Language. Discourse and Cognition, Thought and Language, kind of words for the same notion, only made into something more discoursey. And while I was teaching Thought and Language, I would make notes on things. I ended up with hard disks full of notes of everything I'd read, and full of quotes and examples, and full of all my own ideas. And so I had loads and loads of notes in files written in Word or MS, not Word, didn't exist then, it was kind of MS-DOS or something. And they all went into a folder called TL Book, Thought and Language Book. It's the course Thought and Language. I was going to write a book for that course. And TL Book ended up becoming Discourse and Cognition. By the time I wrote Discourse and Cognition, it had transformed itself via our work in discursive psychology into something quite different than it might have been had I written it earlier. But it had that origin. And it's something I quite like, that people often say that the best kind of teaching is informed by the research. So you develop, you can use your research in your teaching, and that's the advantage maybe for students to go to a university where they do a lot of research and whatever, as if that's going to make the teaching better, whether or not that's the case. But for me, it's both ways. Certainly my research got built into my teaching, but also my teaching informed my research. The things I was having to teach were making me have to read and think about and systematize those ideas. And you can't keep these things separate in your head, so they, don't tell Geoff Cooter I said that. You can't keep these things separate, as I'm saying, in your writing practices. So, Discourse and Cognition was a product of quite a long gestation period, but also was of its time just when it was written, and a kind of sibling book to Jonathan's one. It's like how I thought. I think he thought of it that way, but you can ask him.
Thanks.
Okay.
As one of the founders of Discursive Psychology, can you give a definition, or can you describe what Discursive Psychology is?
I hope you realise that's a horrendous question. Defining discursive psychology. I'm tempted to say, well, here's a reading list, but in a nutshell, discursive psychology is an empirical and theoretical approach to psychological topics such as mental experiences, emotions, psychological traits and attributes, as discourse practices, as things that are formulated and attended to by ordinary people in ordinary lives, as well as by institutional people such as psychiatrists and police officers and so on, in their professional lives. So it's a language-based, discourse-based, interaction-based way of looking at psychological themes and topics. It runs somewhat counter to mainstream psychology through the way it inverts the question and the method. So if you take some of the topics we look at, such as memory, rather than asking what do people remember, how good is their memory or how accurate and what kind of distortions and forgettings occur in the process of memory, which are perfectly legitimate and good questions to ask, important questions to ask, we're looking at something else, which is what's the word memory and remember doing in the language before psychology begins? How does one's relation to one's past feature as a resource in accountability? How are you accountable for the things you've done, the things you know? How is remembering performed in ways that are accountable, examinable, deniable, and so on? And so if you see memory as part of the public accountability of the practices of everyday life, including the technical practices of psychiatry or interrogation or anything else, then not only have you got a different way of looking at it, you've also got a wonderfully empirically tractable way of looking at it. And that is, you can record people doing it. And you don't have to invent hypotheses or experimental designs or statistical procedures or whatever it would be. You can record people talking about whatever they like. And in the course of them living their lives and talking as they live their lives, they will address psychological concerns. So what we're after is, what is the kind of bedrock of psychological concepts and accountability that exists not just in English, say, but in all of the world's cultures? How does any culture of the world manage relations between people and the accountability? I assume they do manage the accountability of actions. What are their terms of reference? What do those things evoke? What work is done by invoking them, and so on? And that's a very rich possibility for an empirical program of research. And it's hardly begun. And here I am after retiring, wishing somebody would do it. Because there's lots to do.
Absolutely. Discursive psychology is closely intertwined with conversational analysis. And you and Jonathan have written about the relationship between psychology and conversational analysis. What is the relationship between discursive psychology and conversational analysis?
Well, for discursive psychologists, one thing is that discursive psychology came out of a variety of places, including linguistic philosophy and linguistics, at least in my case, and also problematics with psychology, and also the examination of textual materials. And so it's got a kind of wider remit than conversational analysis. Mm-hmm. But the prime site for discursive psychology to do its work is what I think Sidnell calls the primordial site of social order, and that is conversation, or talk in social interaction, to be more broad. So we're in the same location as conversation analysis, and conversation analysis is just something pretty wonderful. It's the best thing there is for analysing what's going on in conversation or any kind of talk and interaction. It's the best toolbox there is. But it's more than that, more than a toolbox. It also includes a conception of how social life works, which is very compatible with and conducive to discursive psychology. And that is that it has this ethnomethodological sense of the basis on which people do things. And that is that they do things in ways designed to be understood. They do things as members of a culture, where the whole point of being a member of a culture and interrelating with other members of the culture is that what you do can be seen to be done for what it is. And if there's any problem, you can fix it. You know, it's that notion of how life works. Now, ethnomethodology and CA are often, characterized as not being theoretical, and I take that. But they still work with a kind of fundamental insight into the nature of social life. And that is, I think, wonderful. It attracts me very much, and I think that's how things work. And so that fits very well with the notion that, say, psychological concepts have originated in our language for the ways they act as resources for accountability in relation to actions, in relation to the past, the present, in relation to things like intentionality and responsibility. And so for me, conversation analysis is my favourite thing. Even though I've never trained or been a kind of paid up member, but I love it. I think it's wonderful stuff.
Mm.